I didn't retire because I had enough money. I retired because I ran out of time to pretend I did. 41 years on a factory floor in Ohio. 41 years of clocking in before the sun came up and driving home in the dark. And when it finally ended, when they handed me a cake and a card everyone in the break room signed, I sat down and did the math I'd been avoiding for a decade. Social Security. A small pension from the plant. Together, just under $1,800 a month. Not enough to stay. Barely enough to leave. So I left anyway. My name doesn't matter as much as the house does. Small place on Maple Court, 3 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, the kind of house that looked exactly like 6 other houses on the same street. I bought it in 1986 with my first wife. She passed in 2009. I stayed in that house another 15 years because leaving it felt like losing her twice. I worked the line at a parts plant that made brackets for cars I'll never be able to afford new. Same shift for 4 decades. Same parking spot, more or less. Same guys at the same lunch table, until one by one they retired, or got sick, or just stopped showing up, and the table got quieter every year. I raised 2 kids in that house. My son lives in Denver now. There's something with software I've never fully understood no matter how many times he's explained it. My daughter's in Charlotte, married, 2 kids of her own, a life that's full in the way lives are supposed to be full. They call on Sundays. Good kids. Busy kids. The kind of busy where a phone call is the whole visit. By the time I retired, the house had gotten too big and too quiet at the same time. That's a strange thing to say about the same for walls, but it's true. Too much space for one person, and somehow still not enough silence to drown out the thoughts that show up once the television's off and the dishes are done. The property taxes had crept up every single year, the way they do, a little at a time, until one day you look at the bill and it's nearly double what it was when you moved in. The furnace was 22 years old and coughing through every winter. The roof needed work I kept putting off because putting it off was cheaper than fixing it. Groceries had gotten to the point where I started doing the thing my mother used to do during the Depression stories she told me as a kid, walking the aisles with a calculator in my head, putting things back before I got to the register. I want to be clear about something, because I think people hear I retired on $1,800 a month and assume there's a sob story underneath it, some catastrophe that put me there. There wasn't. I didn't gamble my savings away. I didn't get scammed. I worked hard, for a long time, at a job that paid what it paid, and I saved what I could, and what I could was never quite as much as the financial guys on television say you're supposed to have. I think that's true for more people than are willing to admit it out loud. I wasn't hungry. I wasn't homeless. I want to be honest about that too. But I wasn't living, either. I was maintaining. There's a difference. And once you feel that difference, you can't unfeel it. Every month was the same quiet arithmetic: utility bill, insurance, medication co-pays, whatever was left over spread thin across the rest. No trips to see my son in Denver, because plane tickets don't pay for themselves. No new clothes unless the old ones actually fell apart. No restaurants except the diner on Route 9 twice a month, and even that felt like an indulgence I had to justify to myself on the drive over. I told myself this was just what retirement looked like for a regular guy. Not rich, not poor, just careful. I told myself that for almost 2 years. There's a particular kind of tired that comes from being careful for that long. Not the tired of working a shift. A different tired. The kind that comes from constantly running numbers in the back of your mind while you're supposed to be enjoying your coffee, or watching a ball game, or falling asleep. I'd lie in bed some nights doing subtraction I never asked my brain to do. Property tax bill minus what I had left this month. Furnace repair minus what that would mean for groceries in April. It never stopped, and after 41 years of physical work, I discovered that this kind of tired was somehow worse, because there was no clocking out from it. I started noticing small humiliations I wouldn't have registered a decade earlier. Standing at the pharmacy counter doing mental math on which prescription I could stretch another 2 weeks. Putting a bag of oranges back on the shelf because the price had jumped since the last visit, and feeling my face go a little warm even though nobody around me was paying any attention at all. Turning down my grandson's birthday party in Denver over video call because the flight alone would have eaten a third of a month's income, and telling him some excuse about my knees instead of the truth. None of this was a crisis. That's the part that made it hard to talk about, even with my own kids. A crisis, people rally around. What I had was smaller and quieter than that. Just years, piling up, of a life that had shrunk to fit a number instead of a number that had ever been asked to fit a life. It started, honestly, in the most unremarkable way possible. I couldn't sleep one night, nothing dramatic, just the kind of restlessness that comes more often once you're in your late 60s, and I ended up scrolling through videos on my phone at 2 in the morning. I don't even remember what I searched for first. Something like cheap places to retire. The algorithm did the rest. I found channel after channel of people, some my age, some younger, some clearly struggling and honest about it, some clearly thriving, talking about retiring overseas. Portugal came up a lot. Mexico came up more. But it was the Philippines that kept pulling me back, video after video, night after night, for reasons I couldn't fully explain to myself at first. Maybe it was the English. Everyone I watched said the same thing, that you could get by, really get by, speaking only English, which mattered to a man who'd never been much good at anything else. Maybe it was the cost of living breakdowns. The ones where someone would lay $100 grocery haul out on a kitchen counter and it would be more food than I bought in 2 weeks back home. Maybe it was just the warmth. I'd shoveled a lot of driveways in my life. The idea of never doing that again had a pull to it I wasn't prepared for. I watched for months before I did anything. That's the part nobody tells you. How long the thinking about it phase actually lasts. I'd watch a video, close the app, make dinner, and the whole time I'd be doing that quiet math again, except now the math had a different shape. Not how do I make 1,800 stretch across a month in Ohio, but what would 1,800 actually buy somewhere else? The number that finally moved me wasn't dramatic. It was a woman in one of these videos saying she paid $280 a month for a 1-bedroom apartment with air conditioning, and I sat there and did the subtraction against what I was paying for a mortgage-free house that still cost me over $600 a month just to keep the lights on, the taxes paid, and the water running. That gap, that one number, sat with me for about 3 weeks. I started keeping a small spiral notebook by my recliner, the kind I used to use for grocery lists, except now I filled it with numbers copied down from strangers' videos. Rent in Cebu. Rent in Iloilo. What a plate of food cost at a local market versus what I was paying at the grocery store on Route 9. I didn't tell anyone I was doing this. It felt, at the time, like some private, slightly embarrassing hobby. An old man in Ohio filling a notebook with numbers from a country he'd never once set foot in. But the notebook kept growing, and somewhere around the 40th page, I noticed something had shifted in how I was reading it. I wasn't reading it as a curiosity anymore. I was reading it as a plan. I started pricing out what my house might actually sell for. I called a realtor, told her I was just curious, and she walked the place in 20 minutes and gave me a number that, combined with what I'd saved, would cover the flight, the first year's rent, and a real cushion besides. I sat in my truck in the driveway after she left and didn't turn the key for a long time. Then one Tuesday, I called my daughter and told her I was thinking about selling the house and moving to the Philippines. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Long enough that I almost hung up and pretended I'd never said it. "Dad," she finally said, "is this because of money, or because of something else?" I didn't have a clean answer for her then. I think I do now. It was both. It's always both. 6 weeks later, the house was listed. 10 weeks after that, it sold, for less than I'd hoped, more than I'd feared. I kept 2 suitcases, a box of photographs, and my father's old watch. Everything else went to my kids, to a donation truck, or to a dumpster I filled twice. I flew out of Columbus on a grey Tuesday morning in March, 70 years old, with a one-way ticket and a number in my head that had been the source of so much quiet anxiety for 2 straight years, 1,800. I had no idea that number was about to mean something completely different. Here are the 10 biggest things that changed once I actually landed. The things no video, no matter how many I watched, fully prepared me for. Number 1. The math actually worked, and it shocked me. I want to start here because it's the thing everyone asks first, and because I was skeptical right up until the moment I wasn't. I rented a 1-bedroom apartment in a mid-sized city, furnished, with a balcony, security downstairs, and a pool I still haven't fully gotten used to having. $310 a month. Back in Ohio, my utility bill alone in January could hit half that. Groceries floored me the first month. I went to a local market with $40, genuinely nervous about how little that would buy, the way you're conditioned to think after years of watching a receipt climb higher every visit. I walked out with 2 bags of vegetables, fresh fish still cold from the ice, rice, fruit I didn't have names for yet, and $8 left in my pocket. By the end of the first month, I sat down and did the arithmetic I used to dread. Rent, food, utilities, a little for going out, a little set aside. I was living inside my $1,800 a month with room left over. The first time in 2 years I'd finished a monthly budget with money still sitting in the account instead of a knot in my stomach. That single fact changed something in me before anything else did. For the first time since retirement started, the number in my head stopped being a source of fear. I remember the exact moment it landed. It was a Sunday, and I was sitting at a plastic table outside a little cafe near my building, eating grilled fish and rice that had cost me a little over $2, watching the street go by, and I caught myself doing the old habit, reaching for the mental subtraction, bracing for the guilt that used to follow spending money on something as small as a meal out. And the guilt just didn't come. There was nothing to brace against. I sat there for a full minute, almost confused by the absence of it, like a limb you'd gotten so used to favoring that you forget, for a second, it doesn't hurt anymore. I started a small ledger, out of old habit more than necessity, and after 6 months the pattern held steady enough that I trusted it. Rent, $310. Utilities and water, around $40. Groceries and the occasional meal out, somewhere between $200 and $250. A local health plan, $35. Transportation, mostly tricycles, and the occasional grab ride, maybe $60 a month total. Even with a cushion set aside for the unexpected, I was consistently finishing the month with money still in the account, something that had not happened to me once in the 2 years before I left Ohio. Number 2, nobody warns you about the heat, and I mean nobody. Every video talks about warm weather like it's a simple upgrade from Ohio winters. It is and it isn't. The first 2 weeks, I underestimated it completely. I went out at noon the way I would have back home. No hat, no water, just walking around like I had somewhere important to be. By the second week I understood why every local I saw moved differently than I did. Slower, shaded, timed around the worst of the heat rather than fighting through it. I learned to do my outside errands before 9 in the morning or after 4 in the afternoon. I learned that a small battery fan clipped to a bag is not a joke item, it's a survival tool. I learned that the humidity does something to your clothes and your patience that no amount of YouTube videos prepares you for. But here's the part nobody mentions enough. You adjust faster than you think. By month 3, 88 degrees didn't register as anything unusual. My body simply recalibrated. The Ohio winters I used to dread now sound, from a distance, almost like a fairy tale about a country I used to live in. There's a rhythm to the day here I didn't understand until I'd lived inside it for a while. Mornings belong to errands, to the market, to anything that needs doing outdoors. The middle of the day belongs to shade, to a slow lunch, to the kind of nap I would have been embarrassed to take back in Ohio, where a man napping at 2 in the afternoon felt, to me, like an admission of something. Here it's simply how the day is built. Evenings come alive again once the worst of the heat has broken, and I've come to genuinely love that second wind, the streets filling back up, the food carts lighting their little lamps, a whole second version of the day beginning just as I would have been settling in front of the television back home. I bought 2 things in my first month that I now consider essential and never once owned in Ohio, a proper wide-brimmed hat, and an electrolyte powder I mix into water most mornings. Small, cheap adjustments. They mattered more than I expected. Number 3. I went from invisible to genuinely seen. This one caught me completely off guard, and it's the one I still think about the most. Back home, in the last few years before I retired, I'd started to notice something I couldn't quite name. Cashiers looked past me. Younger co-workers were polite but distracted. I wasn't mistreated. Exactly. I was just background. An older man in a line, a name on a retirement list, a guy who used to matter more to the operation than he currently did. Here, that reversed almost immediately, and it wasn't subtle. The woman who runs the little store on my corner remembers not just my name but my order. The security guard downstairs calls me sir in a way that isn't performative. It's just how respect for elders works here, built into the culture rather than an afterthought. Neighbors greet me. Strangers help carry things without being asked. A teenager on a jeepney once stood up so I could sit down before I'd even registered my knees were bothering me that day. I didn't realize how much I'd been quietly starving for that kind of visibility until I had it again. It's not flattery. It's something closer to dignity, handed back to me in small daily doses I never asked for and now can't imagine living without. There's a word here, po, that gets attached to sentences as a small sign of respect, often directed toward anyone older, and the first time a young man at the market used it toward me without a second thought, I actually had to walk around the block once before heading home, because something about it had hit me harder than I expected it to. I hadn't been spoken to that way in years. Not unkindly, back in Ohio, just neutrally, the way you'd speak to anyone standing in line. Here, age carries a kind of automatic weight I'd genuinely forgotten was possible to feel. It shows up in small, almost invisible ways once you start noticing it. Someone offering their seat without being asked. A younger neighbor stopping by unprompted to ask if I need anything carried up the stairs. The pharmacist double-checking my dosages not because I seem confused, but because checking on an elder is simply what's done. None of it is dramatic. All of it, added together over months, quietly rebuilt something in me I didn't realize had worn thin. Number 4. The loneliness I was running from didn't disappear. It just changed shape. I want to be honest here, because I think the honest parts are the ones that actually help someone watching this. I thought moving would fix the loneliness. It didn't, not entirely, and not immediately. The first 6 weeks were hard in a way I hadn't planned for. I didn't know anyone. My Tagalog was limited to maybe a dozen words. I'd sit on my balcony some evenings and feel further from my kids than I ever had back in Ohio, even though we were only ever a phone call away in both places. I didn't retire because I had enough money. I retired because I ran out of time to pretend I did. 41 years on a factory floor in Ohio. 41 years of clocking in before the sun came up and driving home in the dark. And when it finally ended, when they handed me a cake and a card everyone in the break room signed, I sat down and did the math I'd been avoiding for a decade. Social Security. A small pension from the plant. Together, just under $1,800 a month. Not enough to stay. Barely enough to leave. So I left anyway. My name doesn't matter as much as the house does. Small place on Maple Court, 3 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, the kind of house that looked exactly like 6 other houses on the same street. I bought it in 1986 with my first wife. She passed in 2009. I stayed in that house another 15 years because leaving it felt like losing her twice. I worked the line at a parts plant that made brackets for cars I'll never be able to afford new. What changed the loneliness wasn't the move itself. It was what I did after the move. I started going to the same small carinderia, that's a little local eatery, for breakfast most mornings, and after about 3 weeks, the owner started having my order ready before I sat down. I joined a small group of expats who meet on Thursdays, Mostly retirees like me, some married, some alone, all of us figuring this out in real time together. By month 4, I had something I hadn't had in years back home, a weekly rhythm of people who expected to see me and who noticed when I didn't show up. The loneliness didn't vanish, but it stopped being the only thing in the room. I think about one evening in particular, maybe 5 weeks in, when it was at its worst. I'd had a bad phone connection with my daughter, the kind where half the conversation gets lost and you hang up more frustrated than comforted, and I sat on my balcony afterward and genuinely questioned whether I'd made a mistake. 8,000 miles from everyone who'd known me longer than a season. I wrote in a notebook that night, mostly just to get it out of my head, something like, what if this was the wrong decision made by a scared old man with a spreadsheet? I didn't delete that notebook entry, even now. I like having it, because it reminds me the hard weeks were real, not something I've smoothed over in hindsight. What pulled me out of that particular stretch wasn't a single dramatic turnaround. It was small, repeated things. The Carinderia owner starting to ask about my day. A retired schoolteacher from Michigan at the Thursday meetup who'd been through the exact same 6-week wall and told me, plainly, it gets better around week 10, hang on. She was right, almost to the week. By month 6, I had a standing Tuesday dinner with 2 other retirees from that group, a running joke with the tricycle driver who takes me to the market, and a level of familiarity in my own neighborhood that had taken me years to build on Maple Court, if I'm honest, and I'd lived there for over 3 decades. Number 5. Healthcare surprised me in both directions. I was terrified about this one before I left, and the reality has been more complicated than the fear. The good surprise: a doctor's visit here can run me between $8 and $15. A full set of blood work, the kind that would have cost me a copay and a headache with my old insurance, ran under $40 out of pocket. Dental work, which I'd been putting off for 3 years back home because of cost, got handled here for a fraction of what one filling would have cost me in Ohio. The harder truth: for anything serious, anything that requires a major hospital, you need to actually research where the good facilities are, and they're not evenly spread across the country. I've made peace with the fact that if something major happened, I might need to travel to a bigger city to get the level of care I'd want. I bought a modest local health plan for about $35 a month specifically because of this. It's not perfect, but for the day-to-day, for the things that used to genuinely stress me in the States, this has been one of the biggest, quietest reliefs of the entire move. I had a small scare in month 7, nothing serious in hindsight, a chest pain that turned out to be muscular, but frightening enough in the moment that I went straight to a clinic without hesitation, something I would have talked myself out of back in Ohio purely because of what the bill might look like. That's the part that's hard to explain to people who haven't lived with that particular kind of financial fear. Back home, even with insurance, there was always a second layer of anxiety sitting underneath any symptom. Not just is this serious, but what will this cost me if it is? Here, that second layer of fear has genuinely quieted down. I walked into that clinic, got seen within 20 minutes, ran an EKG and basic blood work, and walked out having paid less than $60 total. I called my daughter that night mostly to tell her I was fine, and found myself, almost as an afterthought, mentioning how easy the whole process had been. She went quiet on the other end of the line in a way that told me she was doing her own version of the math I used to do. Number 6. My relationship with time completely rebuilt itself. 41 years on a factory floor trains a very specific relationship with time. Time is something you clock. Something you're always slightly behind on, or rushing toward, or watching tick down until the next break. I didn't expect that habit to follow me into retirement, but it did, for the first year at least, even back in Ohio. I'd still find myself glancing at my watch out of some old reflex, even with nowhere in particular to be. Here, that started to unwind in a way I didn't push for. It just happened. Meals take longer, and that's not a flaw, it's the point. Conversations at the market run 5-10 minutes past what the transaction actually required, and I stopped seeing that as an inefficiency. There's a rhythm to the day that isn't dictated by a shift schedule or a factory whistle, and it took me nearly 8 months to stop feeling guilty about how slowly some days move now. I sit on my balcony most evenings and genuinely do nothing for 20 or 30 minutes, and for the first time since I was a young man, that doesn't feel like wasted time. It feels like the whole point of everything I worked 41 years toward. I noticed the shift most clearly the first time I missed an appointment and didn't spiral about it. Back home, being even 10 minutes late used to sour my whole mood for an hour. Here, a scheduled repairman showed up nearly 2 hours past the window he'd given me, and I found myself genuinely unbothered, sitting with a cup of coffee, watching the street, in no particular hurry to be anywhere else. My son laughed when I told him that story on our last call. "That does not sound like the man who used to time our car trips to the minute," he said. He wasn't wrong. That man clocked in and clocked out of everything, including, I think, his own family gatherings, always with one eye on the next obligation. I don't recognize that particular version of myself anymore, and I don't miss him. Number 7. I learned to be a beginner again, and it was humbling. I hadn't been bad at something, publicly, in front of strangers, in probably 3 decades. On the factory floor, I knew every machine, every shortcut, every quirk in the process better than almost anyone. I was good at my job. I'd earned that. Here, I am, quite plainly, bad at things. My Tagalog is clumsy and I mispronounce words constantly, and the woman at the market corrects me with a smile every single time, patient in a way that would have embarrassed me at 60 but somehow doesn't at 71. I get lost more than I'd like to admit. I've paid the foreigner price for things more than once before I learned better. There is something quietly good for a person, especially an older person, in being a beginner again. It keeps you humble in a way comfort never does. It reminds you that you're still capable of learning, still capable of being embarrassed and surviving it, still capable of growth this late in the story. I didn't expect retirement to hand me that lesson. I'm grateful it did. I keep a small notebook now, a different one from the numbers notebook that started all this, just for words. 10 new ones a week, roughly. Simple things at first. Good morning, thank you, how much, too expensive. Then slightly harder ones, phrases for the market, for the pharmacy, for small talk with my neighbors. I practiced them badly, out loud, alone in my apartment, feeling every bit as foolish as I did trying to learn a new machine on the factory floor at 23 years old. There's a symmetry in that I didn't expect. I spent my whole working life becoming an expert at one very specific thing. I'm spending my retirement becoming, slowly and imperfectly, a beginner at nearly everything else. Both, it turns out, keep a man sharp in ways I hadn't fully appreciated until I had both to compare. Number 8. My kids worried, then they visited, then everything changed. I need to talk about this one honestly, because I know some of you watching are having this exact conversation with your own children right now. My daughter cried on the phone the week I told her the house had sold. Not because she doubted me exactly, but because the whole idea felt, to her, like her father disappearing to the other side of the world in his 70s, alone, without a safety net she could see or touch. For the first 4 months, our calls had an undercurrent of worry in them I could hear even when she didn't say it outright. Are you eating enough? Do you have someone to call if something happens? Is this really what you want, or is this just what you can afford? Then she visited. 10 days, that first trip. I watched her walk into my apartment expecting, I think, something closer to what she'd imagined from worst-case articles about expats getting scammed. What she found instead was a small, clean, sunlit place, a father who looked healthier and more rested than she'd seen him in a decade, and a neighborhood full of people who already knew my name. On the last night of that visit, she sat across from me at a little restaurant near the water and said something I don't think I'll ever forget. She said, "Dad, I came here worried about you. I'm leaving jealous of you." The worry didn't disappear completely. I don't think it ever fully does for a child watching a parent age, wherever that parent lives. But it changed shape, the same way my loneliness did. It became something closer to pride. My son came 6 months later, over New Year's, and brought his wife and their youngest, who was 3 at the time and had never once seen snow anyway, so the whole idea of abroad meant nothing to her beyond a pool and a grandfather who let her stay up later than her mother allowed. I watched my son, a man who builds software for a living and rarely seems impressed by anything, sit at that same little restaurant by the water and quietly recalculate what he thought he knew about his father's life. He asked me, almost sheepishly, what my monthly budget actually looked like now. When I told him, he sat back in his chair and said, "Dad, you're living better on $1,800 than I am on 5 times that." I don't think he meant it as a complaint about his own life. I think he meant it as a genuine reckoning with how much of what we call enough depends entirely on where you're trying to make it work. Now the calls have a different texture entirely. Less checking in, more actual conversation. My daughter asks about my Thursday group by name. My son wants to know if the new phrases in my notebook are working yet. The worry that used to live underneath every call has mostly been replaced by something that sounds, more than anything else, like genuine curiosity about a father they're getting to know in a new way, this late in both our lives. Number 9. I discovered a version of generosity I didn't know I'd lost. Back home, in my last years working, I noticed I'd gotten careful in a way that had started to calcify into something colder than I liked. Careful with money, obviously, because I had to be. But also careful with time, with attention, with the small kindnesses that used to come naturally to me before for decades of factory floors and financial pressure wore some of the softness off. Here, I've watched people who have far less than I do share meals without a second thought, help neighbors move furniture for nothing but a thank you, and treat visiting strangers with a hospitality that has nothing to do with what those strangers could offer in return. It's rearranged something in me. I find myself picking up the tab more often for the retirees in my Thursday group who was struggling that particular month. I find myself slower to walk past someone who needs a hand. I came here to stretch $1,800 a month further than it stretched in Ohio. I didn't expect the place itself to stretch something in me I thought had gone permanently rigid. There's a woman in my building, easily 80 years old, who sells small home-cooked meals out of her ground floor unit most afternoons, a little business she's run for years, mostly for other elderly residents who don't cook much anymore. She charges almost nothing for it, and when I asked her once why she didn't raise her prices, since the food was better than most of what I could buy elsewhere, she looked at me like the question itself was slightly strange. "Everybody needs to eat," she said, and went back to stirring the pot. That sentence has stayed with me longer than most conversations I've had in years. It wasn't naivety. It was a kind of clarity about what actually matters that I'd let get buried somewhere under for decades of factory floor pragmatism. I've started doing small versions of the same thing. I cover breakfast for whoever's short that week in my Thursday group, without making an announcement of it. I gave my extra electric fan to a young family 2 floors down during a stretch of especially brutal heat, and waved off every attempt they made to pay me back. None of this makes me a different man than I was in Ohio, not fundamentally. But it's loosened something that had been clenched tight for a very long time, and I notice the difference every single week. Number 10. I stopped waiting for my life to restart, because it already had. This is the one that took the longest to understand, and it's the one I think about walking home most evenings. Back in Ohio, somewhere in that last decade of working, I think I'd quietly convinced myself that my real life was already mostly finished, that I'd had my working years, my marriage, my raising kids years, and what remained was just the winding down part. Maintenance. Waiting. I didn't say that out loud to anyone, not even to myself most days, but I lived like it was true. I don't live like that anymore. Not because the Philippines is magic, and not because 1,800 a month suddenly became a fortune. It didn't. It's the same number it always was. What changed is what that number could buy me here, not just in goods and rent, but in mornings that don't start with dread, in a body that gets to move through heat instead of shovel through snow, in a community that sees me instead of looking past me. I am 71 years old, living in a small apartment 8,000 miles from the house I raised my children in, on a budget that used to terrify me. And for the first time in longer than I want to admit, I am not waiting for anything. I am simply, finally, living in it. I want to be careful about how I end this, because I don't think this story is a universal answer, and I don't think every person watching this should sell their house tomorrow because of what happened to me. The Philippines didn't erase my grief for my first wife. It didn't make the distance for my son in Denver and my daughter in Charlotte disappear. I still miss birthdays, still miss the small, ordinary Tuesdays of their lives that I used to be part of. It didn't turn 1,800 into an unlimited budget, and there are still months where I'm careful, where I skip something I'd like to have, where the arithmetic still matters. But it gave me back something I didn't fully realize I'd lost somewhere in those last, quiet, careful years back home. The sense that my life was still mine to shape, not just mine to manage. If you're watching this and you're doing that same quiet math I used to do, looking at a number that feels too small for the life you thought you'd have, I'm not going to tell you the answer is to book a flight tomorrow. I'm going to tell you what I wish someone had told me 2 years earlier, back when I was still just watching videos at 2 in the morning, too afraid to actually do anything about it. The number doesn't have to stay the same size forever. Sometimes the problem was never really the number. Sometimes it's the place you're trying to make that number work inside of. I retired on $1,800 a month, terrified of what that number meant. I'm still living on roughly that same number today. The only thing that changed is everything else. If any part of this sat with you, if you've ever done that same quiet math on your own kitchen table, stay a while. I tell stories like this one here, honestly, without the polish and without the pressure, and I'd be glad of the company. Thank you for watching. And if this helped you see even a little more clearly what this life is really like, consider subscribing, so the next story finds you too. What changed the loneliness wasn't the move itself. It was what I did after the move. I started going to the same small carinderia, that's a little local eatery, for breakfast most mornings, and after about 3 weeks, the owner started having my order ready before I sat down. I joined a small group of expats who meet on Thursdays, mostly retirees like me, some married, some alone, all of us figuring this out in real time together. By month 4, I had something I hadn't had in years back home, a weekly rhythm of people who expected to see me and who noticed when I didn't show up. The loneliness didn't vanish, but it stopped being the only thing in the room. I think about one evening in particular, maybe 5 weeks in, when it was at its worst. I'd had a bad phone connection with my daughter, the kind where half the conversation gets lost and you hang up more frustrated than comforted, and I sat on my balcony afterward and genuinely questioned whether I'd made a mistake. 8,000 miles from everyone who'd known me longer than a season. I wrote in a notebook that night, mostly just to get it out of my head, something like, what if this was the wrong decision made by a scared old man with a spreadsheet? I didn't delete that notebook entry, even now. I like having it, because it reminds me the hard weeks were real, not something I've smoothed over in hindsight. What pulled me out of that particular stretch wasn't a single dramatic turnaround. It was small, repeated things. The carinderia owner starting to ask about my day. A retired schoolteacher from Michigan at the Thursday meetup who'd been through the exact same 6-week wall and told me, plainly, it gets better around week 10, hang on. She was right, almost to the week. By month 6, I had a standing Tuesday dinner with 2 other retirees from that group, a running joke with the tricycle driver who takes me to the market, and a level of familiarity in my own neighborhood that had taken me years to build on Maple Court, if I'm honest, and I'd lived there for over 3 decades. Number 5. Healthcare surprised me in both directions. I was terrified about this one before I left, and the reality has been more complicated than the fear. The good surprise: a doctor's visit here can run me between $8 and $15. A full set of blood work, the kind that would have cost me a copay and a headache with my old insurance, ran under $40 out of pocket. Dental work, which I'd been putting off for 3 years back home because of cost, got handled here for a fraction of what one filling would have cost me in Ohio. The harder truth: for anything serious, anything that requires a major hospital, you need to actually research where the good facilities are, and they're not evenly spread across the country. I've made peace with the fact that if something major happened, I might need to travel to a bigger city to get the level of care I'd want. I bought a modest local health plan for about $35 a month specifically because of this. It's not perfect. But for the day-to-day, for the things that used to genuinely stress me in the States, this has been one of the biggest, quietest reliefs of the entire move. I had a small scare in month 7.